The silence stretched between them on the worn leather couch, heavy with unspoken words that seemed to press against the walls of Jeffrey Taylor's small apartment. The golden light from the table lamp cast shadows across both their faces as William Miller sat rigidly beside him, hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. Jeffrey could feel the heat radiating from William's body despite the careful distance his friend maintained, could hear the slight catch in William's breathing that suggested he was working up the courage to say something that terrified him. William finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. What about? Jeffrey's heart hammered against his ribs as he turned slightly to face his best friend of 3 years, the man he had been secretly, desperately in love with for longer than he cared to admit. William's dark eyes were wide and uncertain, filled with something Jeffrey had never seen there before, something that made his breath catch in his throat. Kutuam, Jeffrey managed, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. William's gaze dropped to his hands, then back up to Jeffrey's face, lingering for a moment on his lips before meeting his eyes again. Quote, the question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, and Jeffrey felt his world tilt on its axis. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments, because what happened next would change everything between them forever. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, sitting in the dim light of Jeffrey's apartment with the weight of years of friendship balanced on the edge of something entirely new, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Jeffrey had been convinced that his feelings for William were a burden he would carry alone for the rest of his life. They had met during their sophomore year of college when William had been assigned as Jeffrey's lab partner in organic chemistry, and what started as a practical partnership had quickly blossomed into an easy friendship. William was everything Jeffrey wasn't: confident where Jeffrey was uncertain, outgoing where Jeffrey preferred the shadows. Jeffrey had fallen for him gradually, the way autumn leaves change color, so slowly that he didn't notice until one day he looked up and realized his entire world had shifted into something beautiful and impossible. It started with small things, the way William would lean close when explaining a difficult concept, close enough that Jeffrey could smell his cologne and feel the warmth of his breath against his ear. For 2 years, Jeffrey had perfected the art of being the supportive best friend. He listened when William complained about his girlfriend, Andrea Rivera, offering advice that felt like swallowing glass. He celebrated when William got accepted to graduate school, even though it meant they might be separated. He showed up to every party, every study session, every late-night conversation, content to exist in William's orbit, even if it meant watching from the sidelines. The torture was exquisite and familiar, a constant ache that Jeffrey had learned to carry like a stone in his chest. He had become an expert at reading the signs of William's romantic troubles, could predict with startling accuracy when Andrea would call crying, when William would show up at Jeffrey's door, looking frustrated and confused. William had said one evening in February, sprawled across Jeffrey's couch with his head in his hands, "Andrea is perfect on paper. She's beautiful. She's smart. She wants the same things I want. So why does it feel like I'm playing a role in my own life?" Jeffrey had wanted to scream that maybe the problem wasn't Andrea. Maybe the problem was that William was trying to force himself into a shape that didn't fit. Instead, he had handed William a beer and asked gentle questions, playing therapist to the man who was slowly destroying him with his proximity and his complete obliviousness to Jeffrey's feelings. Hotag. Jeffrey had offered, hating himself for the lie even as it left his lips. William had looked up at him then with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything except the one thing Jeffrey needed him to see. The knife had twisted deeper in Jeffrey's chest because he knew, with the devastating clarity that comes with unrequited love, that he could be that person for William if only William could see him that way. The breaking point had come in March, on a Thursday evening when William had shown up at Jeffrey's apartment without warning, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. Jeffrey had taken one look at him and stepped aside without a word, letting William collapse onto the couch. William had said simply, and Jeffrey's treacherous heart had leaped with hope before guilt crashed over him like a wave. "I'm sorry," Jeffrey had said, and meant it, because even though he had dreamed of this moment, he hated seeing William in pain. William had laughed, a bitter sound that didn't match his usual warmth. Jeffrey had settled onto the opposite end of the couch, maintaining the careful distance he had perfected over the years. Quote 11. Quote Yahoo. William's voice had been quiet, thoughtful. She said, I talked about you the way other people talk about the person they're in love with. The words had hit Jeffrey like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision blur at the edges. He had spent so long hiding his feelings that the idea of them being visible to anyone, especially to Andrea, felt like being stripped naked in public. That's ridiculous, Jeffrey had managed, but his voice came out strained and unconvincing. William had turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Jeffrey had felt exposed under that gaze, as if William could suddenly see through all the careful walls he had built. Is it? William had asked softly. The question had hung between them like a lit fuse, and Jeffrey had felt panic rise in his throat. He wasn't ready for this conversation, wasn't prepared to have his carefully constructed world come crashing down around him. I think you're just upset about the breakup, Jeffrey had said, standing abruptly and moving toward the kitchen. Let me make some coffee. But William had followed him, and when Jeffrey turned around, he found his friend standing closer than usual, close enough that Jeffrey could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Jeff, William had said, and there was something in his voice that Jeffrey had never heard before, something vulnerable and uncertain. Can I ask you something? Jeffrey's hands had been shaking as he reached for the coffee filters, and he had gripped the counter to steady himself. Quote 21, quote. The question had come out of nowhere, hitting Jeffrey like a lightning bolt. He had turned slowly to face William, searching his friend's face for any sign that this was a joke. But William's expression had been completely serious. Jeffrey had started, then stopped, because how could he answer that question without revealing everything? William had continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Jeffrey had stared at him, certain he was dreaming, certain that his desperate mind had finally snapped and started creating the conversations he had always longed to have. He had breathed. William had rushed on, running his hands through his hair. The kitchen had felt too small suddenly, the air too thick to breathe. Jeffrey had gripped the counter harder, his knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. Quote 28, he had whispered, even though part of him already knew. William had stepped closer, close enough that Jeffrey could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something new, something that spoke of vulnerability and possibility. Quote 29. William had said simply, quote 30. The words had crashed over Jeffrey like a tsunami, washing away 3 years of careful control and leaving him gasping in their wake. Quote, Jeffrey had asked, his voice barely audible. William's hand had stilled on his, and Jeffrey had seen something flicker across his friend's face, something that looked like shame mixed with wonder. Quote 32. William had admitted. Quote 33. The words had been like a key turning in a lock Jeffrey hadn't even known existed, opening doors in his mind that he had kept firmly closed. All those moments over the past 3 years suddenly took on new meaning. I thought I was going crazy, Jeffrey had whispered. I thought I was seeing things that weren't there. William's eyes had widened. Quote 36. Jeffrey had laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and relief. To 7. The words had tumbled out before he could stop them. 3 years of secrets spilling into the space between them like water through a broken dam. William had gone very still, his hand frozen on Jeffrey's, his eyes searching Jeffrey's face. William had repeated softly. Jeffrey had nodded, feeling exposed and terrified and more vulnerable than he had ever been in his life. Quote 39. William had been quiet for a long moment, processing this information, and Jeffrey had felt panic begin to creep up his throat. Quote 40. William had said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Quote 40. Jeffrey had raised his eyes to meet William's gaze, and what he saw there had stolen his breath. There was wonder in William's eyes, and something that looked like relief, and underneath it all, something warm and soft that Jeffrey had never dared to hope he would see directed at him. Quote 40. William had whispered. Quote Arndt. The kitchen had felt charged with electricity, the air thick with possibility, and the weight of words that had been held back for too long. Quote how? Jeffrey had asked because he needed to hear it spelled out. William had stepped closer, so close now that Jeffrey could count his eyelashes, could see the way his pupils had dilated slightly. William had said, quote, "Damn." The words had been like a match struck in darkness, illuminating everything Jeffrey had been too afraid to hope for. But even as his heart soared, doubt had crept in around the edges. Jeffrey had whispered. William's free hand had come up to cup Jeffrey's face, his thumb brushing across his cheekbone in a gesture so tender it had made Jeffrey's eyes flutter closed. "What if we don't try and spend the rest of our lives wondering what could have been?" William had countered. "What if this is exactly what we're supposed to be?" Jeffrey had opened his eyes to find William looking at him with such intensity that it had taken his breath away. "I'm terrified," Jeffrey had admitted. "So am I," William had said. "But I'm more terrified of losing you because I was too much of a coward to tell you how I feel." "So what do we do now?" Jeffrey had asked. William's thumb had continued its gentle path across Jeffrey's cheek, and Jeffrey had found himself leaning into the touch without conscious thought. "Now we figure it out together," William had said. "One step at a time." "Can I kiss you?" William had asked, his voice soft and uncertain. "Please," Jeffrey had whispered, and then William's lips had been on his, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss had been everything Jeffrey had dreamed it would be, and nothing like he had imagined all at the same time. It had started gentle, tentative, William's lips barely brushing against his. But when Jeffrey had made a soft sound of encouragement, when his hands had come up to fist in William's shirt and pull him closer, the kiss had deepened into something urgent and desperate. 3 years of wanting poured into the connection between their mouths. William had tasted like coffee and possibility, and when his tongue had swept across Jeffrey's lower lip, Jeffrey had felt his knees go weak. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing hard, William had rested his forehead against Jeffrey's and smiled, a real smile that had lit up his entire face. Quote 59, William had breathed. Quote 60, Mom. Jeffrey had agreed because coherent thought had been beyond him in that moment. They had stood there in Jeffrey's kitchen, holding each other and breathing the same air, and Jeffrey had felt something settle into place in his chest, something that felt like coming home after a long journey. "This changes everything," William had said softly. "Is that okay?" Jeffrey had asked, because he needed to be sure. William had pulled back to look at him, and the expression on his face had been so full of wonder and affection that Jeffrey had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "It's more than okay," William had said. "It's perfect." That had been 3 months ago, and in the time since, Jeffrey's life had been transformed in ways he was still trying to understand. The transition from friendship to something more had been surprisingly natural, as if they had simply been waiting for permission to be what they had always been meant to be. They had spent hours talking, working through the implications of what their relationship meant for their futures, for their families, for the way they moved through the world. William had been patient with Jeffrey's moments of doubt, the times when Jeffrey would wake up convinced that this was all too good to be true. "I'm not going anywhere," William would say during those moments, pulling Jeffrey close and holding him until the fear passed. "This isn't some experiment for me, Jeff. This is real." And slowly, Jeffrey had begun to believe him. The evidence was there in the way William looked at him when he thought Jeffrey wasn't paying attention, in the way he had started talking about their future together as if it were a given. They had moved in together 2 months ago, William's lease expiring at the perfect moment to make the transition feel natural rather than rushed. Jeffrey's small apartment had become their shared space, filled with William's books and coffee mugs and the comfortable chaos of two lives intertwining. Which brought them back to this moment, sitting on their couch in the golden light of evening, the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "Do you ever regret it?" Jeffrey asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Taking the risk, I mean, changing everything between us." William turned to look at him with those dark eyes that had been Jeffrey's undoing from the very beginning, and the expression on his face was so full of love and certainty that Jeffrey felt his breath catch. Quote 69, William said firmly. Quote 70. Jeffrey felt something tight in his chest finally relax, a knot of anxiety he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Jeffrey admitted, "that this is all some elaborate dream, and I'm still just your friend who's hopelessly in love with you." William's hand found his. their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Both 7 Jeffrey nodded. Quote 7 William said softly. Quote 7. The words settled over Jeffrey like a warm blanket, chasing away the last lingering shadows of doubt. He squeezed William's hand, marveling at how something so simple could feel so profound. I love you, Jeffrey said. And even though they had exchanged those words countless times over the past few months, saying them still felt like a small miracle. I love you too, William replied, leaning over to press a soft kiss to Jeffrey's temple. Watched it around him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set through the windows of their apartment. Jeffrey thought about all the evenings they had spent in this same spot when they were just friends, the careful distance he had maintained. Now William was curled against his side, solid and warm and completely his. Dodge? William asked, his voice soft and curious. Jeffrey considered the question, trying to put into words the complex tangle of gratitude and wonder and disbelief that filled his chest. Quote, Jeffrey said finally, boys. William shifted slightly, turning so he could see Jeffrey's face better. What changed your mind? You did, Jeffrey said simply. The way you looked at me that night in the kitchen. The way you weren't afraid to take the risk, even when you didn't know how I felt. William's expression softened, and he reached up to trace the line of Jeffrey's jaw with gentle fingers. You know what I think? What? I think we were always heading toward this, William said. I think maybe on some level we both knew, even when we were too scared to admit it. All those late nights talking, all those moments when we would catch each other staring, all those times when being apart felt wrong somehow. Jeffrey considered this, thinking back over the years of their friendship with new eyes. There had been signs, he realized now, moments when the line between friendship and something more had blurred. You're probably right, Jeffrey admitted. I just wish I had been braver sooner. William's thumb brushed across Jeffrey's cheekbone, and Jeffrey leaned into the touch automatically. We weren't ready sooner, William said gently. I wasn't ready. I needed time to figure out who I was, to understand what I was feeling. And you needed time to believe that you were worth taking a risk for. The insight hit Jeffrey like a gentle blow because it was true. Even if William had confessed his feelings earlier, Jeffrey wasn't sure he would have been able to believe them. Jeffrey asked, Quote 94. William was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Quote 95, he said finally. Quote 96. Jeffrey remembered that weekend, how miserable he had been and how William had shown up with soup and medicine and refused to leave until Jeffrey was feeling better. Quote 97, Jeffrey asked. Quote 98, and William said. Quote 90, Jeffrey felt his heart clench with emotion, remembering how safe and cared for he had felt during those few days. Quote 100, Jeffrey said. Quote 100, quote, William said with a small smile. Quote 100. They fell into comfortable silence again, both lost in their own memories of the slow evolution of their relationship. Quote 104. William said suddenly, his voice slightly hesitant. Jeffrey turned to look at him, noting the slight flush that had crept up William's neck. What kind of confession? The night I broke up with Andrea, William said, I didn't come here because I was upset about the breakup. I came here because I had finally admitted to myself that I was in love with you, and I was terrified about what that meant. Jeffrey stared at him, processing this information. You knew before you broke up with her? William nodded, looking slightly ashamed. I had been thinking about it for weeks, maybe months. The conversation we had about feeling like I was playing a role in my own life, that wasn't just about Andrea. That was about everything. Why didn't you tell me that night? Jeffrey asked, curious rather than accusatory. Because I was terrified, William said simply. Because I had no idea how you felt, and the thought of ruining our friendship was unbearable. Jeffrey thought back to that evening, remembering how strange William had seemed. And then I panicked and ran to the kitchen, Jeffrey said with a rueful laugh. And then you panicked and ran to the kitchen, William agreed. But I followed you because I realized that I couldn't keep living in limbo. I had to know, one way or another. Best decision you ever made, Jeffrey said softly. Best decision we ever made, William corrected. Jeffrey leaned back against the couch cushions, pulling William with him so they were lying together, William's head on Jeffrey's chest. He could feel William's heartbeat against his ribs, steady and reassuring. Jeffrey asked, his fingers combing through William's hair. If Andrea hadn't said what she said? William was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I think so, he said finally. I think we were both getting to the point where pretending wasn't sustainable anymore. Jeffrey thought about this, about the trajectory they had been on before that pivotal night in March. William was probably right. They had both been reaching a breaking point. I'm glad it happened the way it did, Jeffrey said. I'm glad you were brave enough to take the first step. I'm glad you were brave enough to meet me halfway, William replied, tilting his head up to look at Jeffrey. The evening light was fading now, casting their apartment in soft shadows. Jeffrey reached over to turn on the lamp, not wanting to lose the ability to see William's face clearly. When the warm light filled the room, William smiled at him, one of those soft, intimate smiles that still had the power to make Jeffrey's heart skip. What do you want for dinner? William asked, the practical question a gentle return to the everyday reality of their shared life. I don't care, Jeffrey said honestly, as long as we eat it together. William laughed, a sound that Jeffrey had grown to love more than any music. You're getting sappy in your old age. I've always been sappy, Jeffrey protested. I just hid it better when I thought you were straight. Well, I'm glad you don't have to hide it anymore, William said, pressing a kiss to Jeffrey's collarbone through his shirt. Jeffrey felt heat creep up his neck because it was true. Since they had gotten together, he had become embarrassingly romantic, unable to resist small gestures of affection. Quote 132, Jeffrey pointed out. Quote 133, William said with a grin. Quote 34. Jeffrey felt his chest tighten with emotion, because it was true. Their relationship was built on small kindnesses and daily considerations. Jeffrey said quietly. William said, settling more comfortably against Jeffrey's chest, I love that we don't have to pretend anymore. I love that I can touch you whenever I want to. They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening. Can I tell you something? Jeffrey said softly. Always. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, Jeffrey admitted. Sometimes I look at you and think about how lucky I am, and it feels too good to be true. William shifted so he could see Jeffrey's face, his expression serious and tender. He said firmly. The distinction hit Jeffrey like a revelation, because William was right. This wasn't about luck or chance. This was about two people who had found each other and chosen each other. I love you so much it scares me sometimes, Jeffrey confessed. Good, William said with a smile. Love should be a little scary. It means it matters. Jeffrey pulled William closer, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. What do you think we'll be like in 5 years? Jeffrey asked. William was quiet for a moment. I think we'll be even more comfortable with each other than we are now, William said finally. I think we'll probably be planning a wedding, or maybe already married. The casual mention of marriage made Jeffrey's heart skip. Quote 150. Jeffrey asked, trying to keep his voice light, even though the question felt enormous. William turned in his arms so they were facing each other, his expression serious and certain. The words washed over Jeffrey like a benediction, settling into his chest and filling all the empty spaces he hadn't even known were there. I'm ready now, Jeffrey said without hesitation. I've been ready since that night in the kitchen when you told me you wanted to stop pretending. William's face lit up with joy, and he leaned forward to kiss Jeffrey softly, a kiss that tasted like promises. And forever. 154. William said against Jeffrey's lips, we'll plan a wedding and invite everyone we love and make it official. Jeffrey felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his happiness. I can't wait to call you my husband, Jeffrey said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. I can't wait to call you mine, William replied, and the possessiveness in his voice made Jeffrey shiver with pleasure. They kissed again, deeper this time, and Jeffrey felt the familiar spark of desire that William's touch always ignited. When they broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, William rested his forehead against Jeffrey's and smiled. We should probably eat something, William said, though he made no move to get up. Probably, Jeffrey agreed, equally reluctant to break the spell of the moment. They lay there for a few more minutes, trading lazy kisses and quiet words of love, before William finally forced himself to sit up. "Come on," William said, extending his hand to help Jeffrey up. "Let's make dinner together." Jeffrey took his hand and let William pull him to his feet, following him toward the kitchen where so much of their relationship had been born. As they moved around each other in the familiar dance of cooking together, Jeffrey thought about how perfectly domestic this felt. "What are you smiling about?" William asked, noticing Jeffrey's expression. "Quote Haas of 63, Jeffrey said. Quote Orshadu 63. William set down his knife and moved to stand behind Jeffrey, wrapping his arms around his waist and pressing a kiss to the side of his neck. "Quote Tapton," William murmured against his skin. Quote Wanasua. Jeffrey leaned back into William's embrace, feeling completely content and secure in the knowledge that this was just the beginning. As they finished preparing dinner and sat down to eat together, Jeffrey reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It hadn't been easy, the path from friendship to love, but it had been worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. Quote 167 Malt, Jeffrey said suddenly. Quote 168, William asked, looking up from his plate. Quote 169, Jeffrey said. Quote 170. William reached across the table to take Jeffrey's hand. "Thank you for letting me," William said simply. "Thank you for taking the risk with me. Thank you for loving me back." Later, as they settled into bed together, Jeffrey curled against William's side with his head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. But our Jeffrey said softly into the darkness, quote Warner, quote Duanum, quote Wanan. William said, his hand stroking gently through to Jeffrey's hair. "I've been thinking about that question a lot lately," Jeffrey said, "about how sometimes the most important changes happen so gradually that you don't notice them until you look back and realize everything is different." "What do you mean?" William asked, though Jeffrey could hear in his voice that he already understood. "I mean that I think I was falling in love with you long before I admitted it to myself," Jeffrey said. "I think maybe we were both changing, both moving toward this for a lot longer than either of us realized." William was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You might be right," he said finally. "Maybe that's why it felt so natural once we finally acknowledged what was happening." Jeffrey thought about this, about all the small moments and gradual shifts that had led them to where they were now. "I'm glad we figured it out," Jeffrey said sleepily. "So am I," William said, pressing a kiss to the top of Jeffrey's head. Quote, as Jeffrey fell asleep, he thought about how different his life was now compared to a year ago, how much richer and fuller and more meaningful everything had become. He thought about the future William had described, about marriage and growing old together. But mostly he thought about how grateful he was that William had been brave enough to ask that question on a quiet evening in March, brave enough to acknowledge that sometimes things change between people in the most beautiful and unexpected ways. 3 weeks later, Jeffrey stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building in his chest all morning. Today was the day William had planned something special, though he had been maddeningly secretive about the details. William said from the doorway, and Jeffrey turned to find his boyfriend leaning against the frame with a soft smile on his face. Jeffrey admitted, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. William stepped into the bathroom and moved to stand behind Jeffrey, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Why are you nervous?" "I don't know," Jeffrey said honestly. "You've been acting strange all week, and you won't tell me what we're celebrating tonight." William's hands came to rest on Jeffrey's shoulders, and Jeffrey could see something flickering in his expression, something that looked like anticipation mixed with nerves. "What if I told you that tonight is going to be one of the best nights of our lives?" William said softly. The words sent a shiver down Jeffrey's spine because there was something in William's tone that suggested this was about more than just dinner. The restaurant was exactly as Jeffrey remembered it, warm and intimate with soft lighting. They were seated at the same table where they had shared their first date, and Jeffrey felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. "Do you remember what you ordered on our first date?" William asked. "Chicken parmesan," Jeffrey said with a smile, "and I was so nervous I could barely eat it." "I remember," William said, his eyes twinkling with affection. "You kept apologizing for being awkward, and I kept thinking about how cute you were when you were flustered." When their entrees arrived, William barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate while Jeffrey ate and tried to figure out what was going on. Finally, when Jeffrey was halfway through his meal, William set down his fork and took a deep breath. "Jeff," William said, his voice slightly shaky, "can I ask you something?" Jeffrey looked up, noting the way William's hands were trembling slightly where they rested on the table. Quote 200. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it on the table between them. Jeffrey's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at, his heart beginning to race with a mixture of shock and overwhelming joy. "I know we've talked about this," William said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I know we've said we want to spend our lives together. But I wanted to make it official. I wanted to ask you properly." William picked up the box and opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the candlelight. Jeffrey stared at it, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Jeffrey Taylor," William said, his voice soft but clear, "will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jeffrey felt his world shift on its axis once again, the same way it had that night in the kitchen when William had first confessed his feelings. "Yes," Jeffrey whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." William's face broke into the most beautiful smile Jeffrey had ever seen, and he slipped the ring onto Jeffrey's finger with hands that shook slightly with emotion. The ring fit perfectly, and when Jeffrey looked down at it, he felt a surge of love so intense it took his breath away. "I love you," William said, reaching across the table to take Jeffrey's hand. Jeffrey said, tears streaming down his face now. William said, echoing the words he had spoken so many times over the past months. Quote them. As they walked home from the restaurant, Jeffrey's hand firmly clasped in William's. Jeffrey felt like he was floating several inches off the ground. The ring on his finger felt foreign and wonderful, a tangible reminder that their relationship had entered a new phase. Quote 243, Jeffrey said as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Quote 244, William admitted as he unlocked their door. Quote 259. Jeffrey stopped in the hallway, staring at William with surprise and affection. Quote 6, William shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. Quote 7. Jeffrey felt his heart melt a little more, because of course William had thought to include their families in this moment. Jeffrey asked as they settled onto their couch. Quote 220, William said, pulling Jeffrey close. Quote 220. Jeffrey laughed, remembering some of the conversations they had shared with the Williams family over the past few months. William had indeed been fairly obvious about his intentions. I should call my parents, Jeffrey said, but he made no move to get up, too content to be held by his fiancée. They can wait a few more minutes, William said, pressing a kiss to Jeffrey's temple. Quote 223. Jeffrey settled more comfortably against William's side, holding up his hand to admire the ring in the lamplight. How did you know my size? Jeffrey asked. William grinned, looking pleased with himself. I may have borrowed one of your other rings and had it sized. You never even noticed it was gone. Jeffrey shook his head in amazement at William's attention to detail. But to quote Tana, William said softly, quote, the casual mention of children made Jeffrey's heart skip. Our children, Jeffrey repeated, testing the words on his tongue. If you want them, William said quickly. I know we haven't talked about specifics yet, but I hope you know that I want everything with you. Jeffrey turned in William's arms so he could see his face clearly. Klaus 232, he said firmly. Klaus 233. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Jeffrey felt like his heart might have burst from the sheer volume of happiness contained in his chest. When they broke apart, Jeffrey reached in for his phone to call his parents. The conversation was exactly as joyful and emotional as he had expected. His mother crying happy tears and his father offering gruff congratulations. Quote 234. His mother said through her tears. Quote 235. After they hung up, Jeffrey and William spent the evening calling friends and family members, sharing their news and basking in the warm congratulations. Each conversation made the engagement feel more real, more solid. Later that night, as they lay in bed together, Jeffrey curled against William's side with his head on his chest. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. I'm so proud of us, Jeffrey said softly into the darkness. What do you mean? William asked, his hand stroking gently through Jeffrey's hair. Quote 238, Jeffrey said. Quote 239. William was quiet for a moment, considering this. Quote 240, he said finally. Quote 241. Jeffrey thought about his younger self, the man who had been so afraid of his own feelings that he had spent years hiding them even from himself. Quote tonight's song, Jeffrey said. Quote it offer, quote tires. William said, pressing a kiss to the top of Jeffrey's head. I'm grateful that we found each other, and I'm grateful that we were both brave enough to take the risk. As Jeffrey drifted towards sleep, he thought about their future, about the wedding they would plan, and the life they would build together. But mostly he thought about how lucky he was to have found someone who loved him enough to see past his fears to the person he was capable of becoming. 6 months later, Jeffrey stood in front of a full-length mirror in the small room adjacent to the chapel where their wedding ceremony would take place in less than an hour. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie, nervous energy coursing through his veins despite the certainty he felt about what he was about to do. You look perfect, his sister Emma Green said from behind him, and Jeffrey turned to see her standing in the doorway with tears already threatening to spill from her eyes. I'm terrified, Jeffrey admitted, though he was smiling as he said it. Good terrified or bad terrified? Emma asked, moving to stand beside him. Good terrified, Jeffrey said without hesitation. The kind of terrified that comes from knowing your entire life is about to change in the most wonderful way possible. Emma smiled, her expression soft with affection and pride. I'm so happy for you, Jeff. William is perfect for you. Jeffrey felt his chest tighten with emotion because Emma's opinion meant everything to him. Quote 252, Jeffrey asked, quote 253. Emma said with a laugh, quote darn. Jeffrey smiled at the image because he could perfectly picture William's pre-wedding nerves. 5 minutes, came a voice from the hallway, and Jeffrey felt his heart rate spike with anticipation and excitement. Emma squeezed his hand and gave him one final once-over. Ready to get married? I've been ready for years, Jeffrey said honestly. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and joy. Jeffrey's clearest memory would always be the moment when the doors opened and he saw William standing at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his black suit. Their eyes met across the length of the chapel, and William's face broke into a smile so radiant that Jeffrey felt his knees go weak. The walk down the aisle felt both eternal and instantaneous, Jeffrey's focus entirely on William's face. When Jeffrey finally reached the altar and took William's hands in his, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him. When it came time for their vows, William spoke first, his voice clear and strong, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Quote 258. William began, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of Jeffrey's hands. 3 years ago, you were assigned as my lab partner, and I thought I was just gaining a study buddy. I had no idea that I was meeting the love of my life. Jeffrey felt tears slip down his cheeks as William continued. You taught me that love isn't about finding someone who fits into the life you think you're supposed to have. It's about finding someone who makes you want to build an entirely new life. I promise to love you through every season of our lives, to be your best friend and your biggest supporter. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my life. Jeffrey was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the beauty of William's words. When it was his turn to speak, Jeffrey took a moment to compose himself. Jeffrey began, his voice thick with emotion. Jeffrey's voice grew stronger as he continued. I promise to never take for granted the gift of your love, to support your dreams and celebrate your successes. I promise to love you with everything I have, for as long as I live, because you are my heart and my home and my greatest blessing. When they exchanged rings, Jeffrey felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a benediction. You may kiss your husband, the officiant said with a smile, and William didn't hesitate, cupping Jeffrey's face in his hands and kissing him with a passion that made the congregation cheer and applaud. The reception was a blur of congratulations and dancing, of speeches from family and friends. Jeffrey's father surprised everyone by giving a toast that brought tears to every eye in the room. Quote 265, his father said, his voice gruff but warm. Quote to Sigrid. As the evening wound down and guests began to filter out, Jeffrey and William found themselves alone on the dance floor, swaying together to the soft music that continued to play. Quote to 67. William asked softly, his lips brushing against Jeffrey's ear. Perfect, Jeffrey said without hesitation. It feels like everything finally makes sense. William pulled back to look at him, his expression soft and wondering. I love you, husband. The word sent a thrill through Jeffrey because it was real now, official and legal, and recognized by the world. I love you too, husband, Jeffrey replied, and they both smiled at the newness of the word. As they drove home that night, still in their wedding clothes but finally alone together, Jeffrey reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Do you remember what you asked me that night? Jeffrey said as they pulled into their driveway. About whether I ever felt things change between people? William smiled, his hand finding Jeffrey's across the center console of the car. It's the 274. Quote 27, Jeffrey said. Quote 276. William brought Jeffrey's hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to his wedding ring. The best changes, he said softly, the ones that matter most. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts about the day and what it meant for their future. Come on, husband, William said eventually, his voice warm with affection and promise. Let's go home. As they walked up the path to their front door, Jeffrey's hand firmly clasped in William's. Jeffrey felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was home, this life they had built together, this love that had grown from friendship into something deeper and more beautiful than he had ever imagined possible. They had taken the biggest risk of their lives when they decided to change the nature of their relationship, had been brave enough to acknowledge that sometimes the most frightening questions led to the most wonderful discoveries. And now, as they crossed the threshold into their home as husbands, Jeffrey knew with absolute certainty that every moment of fear and uncertainty had been worth it. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, the ones that grew slowly and steadily until they became the foundation of everything you were. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you found someone who was willing to sit beside you in silence and ask if you ever felt things change. Someone who was patient enough to wait for your answer and courageous enough to build something beautiful from whatever truth you offered in return. As Jeffrey fell asleep that night in his husband's arms, he smiled at the memory of that question, the simple words that had opened the door to everything they had become. Yes, he thought sleepily, things do change between people. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, they change in the most warm, wonderful ways imaginable.